Racist judge tells black teen, "You'll never be a lawyer." Years later, she defends him in court один. Унижение 14-летняя Терри Слоан пришла с классом в суд. Когда она подняла руку и задала вопрос о расовой дискриминации, судья Кэмпбелл нахмурился и процедил: «Ты не в Гарварде, милая. Вернись к своим мультикам». Весь зал захихикал. Учительница не вмешалась. Дусра. Усиление конфликта. Она попыталась поступить в юридическую программу, ее заявления терялись. Ее родители получили предупреждение: дочь слишком шумная, может попасть в неприятности. Терри работала по ночам, училась онлайн. Один раз ее остановили полицейские, просто за то, что шла в костюме по улице. Третье обнаружение истины. Через 10 лет она выигрывает федеральный грант. Газеты пестрят заголовками: «Дочь водителя автобуса – самый перспективный юрист года». Ее назначают в комиссию по дисциплинарному делу против судьи Кэмпбелла. Четвертое возмездие. Терри приводит доказательства его предвзятости, десятки дел пересматриваются. Он пытается извиниться, но комиссия рекомендует отстранение. Его имя вычеркивают из юридических альманахов. Пятая трансформация. На стене ее офиса висит табличка: «Если тебе сказали, что ты не сможешь, это повод доказать, что ты уже смогла». Она выступает на TEDx. «Мои враги сделали меня сильнее». Racist judge tells black teen, "You'll never be a lawyer." Years later, she defends him in court. She was just another face in the crowded courtroom that day, a 14-year-old girl whose raised hand would change everything. Nobody expected the quiet kid from the back row to shatter a judge's world with a single question. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like dying wasps as Terry Sloan shifted in the hard wooden seat. The courthouse smelled of old paper and industrial disinfectant, that sharp chemical tang that made her nose wrinkle. Around her, 23 other eighth graders fidgeted through their mandatory civics field trip, their whispered conversations creating a soft buzz that echoed off the marble walls. Judge Kemble sat behind his mahogany bench like a king on his throne, his black robes draping dramatically as he explained the intricacies of criminal procedure. His voice carried the authority of decades, each word carefully measured and delivered with the precision of someone accustomed to absolute attention. The students sat mostly silent, intimidated by the gravitas of the courtroom, the weight of justice that seemed to press down from the high ceilings. Terry had been invisible all morning. She'd arrived early, chosen a seat in the back corner, and watched as her classmates clustered together in their familiar groups. The popular kids claimed the front rows, their designer backpacks casually tossed on the floor. The athletes sprawled across the middle section, their Letterman jackets a armor of belonging. And there was Terry, alone in her carefully ironed thrift store blazer, taking notes in a composition notebook while others played games on their phones. Mrs. Henderson, their teacher, had barely glanced in Terry's direction all morning. It was a familiar pattern, the way adults' eyes seemed to slide right past her, as if she were part of the furniture. Even when she'd scored the highest grade on their Constitution test last week, Mrs. Henderson had handed back the paper with nothing more than a distracted nod. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted when Judge Kemble opened the floor for questions. Hands shot up immediately. Jason Park asking about sentencing guidelines, Madison Cooper inquiring about jury selection. The judge smiled at each query, his responses patient and encouraging. He even chuckled when Brad Morrison made a joke about legal terminology. Terry's hand rose slowly, almost hesitantly. She'd been thinking about the case they'd just observed, a drug possession charge where the defendant had been a young black man not much older than her brother Marcus. The public defender had seemed rushed, overwhelmed, barely present. The plea bargain had been swift, decisive, and somehow felt wrong in a way she couldn't quite articulate. "Yes?" Judge Kemble's voice carried a note of mild surprise as his gaze fell on her for the first time that morning. Terry stood, her notebook clutched against her chest like a shield. "Your Honor, I was wondering about the case we just saw. The defendant was 19, first offense, and he got 2 years. But last month, I read about a similar case in the Tribune where a white college student got probation for the same charge. Is that how the system is supposed to work?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Judge Kemble's face darkened, his eyebrows drawing together in an expression Terry had seen before. On store clerks who followed her through aisles, on teachers who assumed she couldn't keep up, on police officers who stopped her father for routine traffic checks. "You're not at Harvard Law, sweetheart." Judge Kemball's voice dripped with condescension, each word carefully enunciated to maximize its sting. "Maybe stick to cartoons and leave the legal analysis to the grown-ups." The courtroom erupted in scattered laughter. Not everyone joined in. Some students looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, but enough chuckled to make Terry's cheeks burn with humiliation. She heard Madison whisper something about ghetto kids thinking they know everything, and felt her stomach clench. Mrs. Henderson said nothing, did nothing, just checked her watch and made a note on her clipboard as if a student hadn't just been publicly eviscerated for asking a thoughtful question. Terry sank back into her seat, her notebook trembling in her hands. The fluorescent light seemed brighter now, harsh and unforgiving. The smell of disinfectant made her nauseous. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the wooden bench and never have to face another curious glance or whispered comment. But something else kindled in her chest as she sat there in the suffocating silence. A spark of defiance that refused to be extinguished by Judge Kemball's sneer or her classmates' laughter. She opened her notebook and wrote one line at the top of a fresh page. "Prove them wrong." The years that followed were a masterclass in systematic discouragement. Terry's applications to competitive high school programs mysteriously got lost in the system. Her guidance counselor, Ms. Patterson, kept steering her toward more realistic career paths, nursing, maybe, or elementary education, something suitable for someone with her background. Her parents, Beverly and William Sloan, felt the pressure too. Beverly cleaned office buildings downtown, often working through the night to support Terry's academic ambitions. William drove city buses, his large hands gentle on the steering wheel as he navigated traffic, while Terry studied in the back seat during his breaks. They believed in their daughter's dreams, but they also knew the weight of the world pressing down on families like theirs. "Maybe Ms. Patterson has a point," Beverly said one evening as she counted out bills at the kitchen table. "Law school's expensive, baby, and you know how they look at people like us in those fancy offices." But Terry had already made her choice. She worked nights at a 24-hour diner, serving coffee to insomniacs and drunk college students while she studied online legal courses on her laptop. The Wi-Fi was spotty, the keyboard sticky with spilled syrup, but she absorbed every case study, every constitutional principle, every procedural rule. She learned to navigate the subtle warfare of institutional racism, the way her emails went unanswered while her white classmates got immediate responses, the way professors called on everyone except her during Socratic seminars, the way study groups somehow forgot to include her in their group chats. She documented everything, filing away each slight and snub like evidence in a case she was building against the world. There was the night she was stopped by police while walking home from the library, her arms full of law books. Officer Rodriguez had shined his flashlight directly in her eyes, demanding to know why she was dressed up like a lawyer at 11 p.m. Her business suit, a clearance rack find from Marshall's, had apparently looked suspicious in her own neighborhood. "You lost, miss?" the officer had asked, his hand resting casually on his belt. "This doesn't seem like your kind of area." Terry had stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, and recited her address, her student ID number, and her rights under the Fourth Amendment. Officer Rodriguez had eventually let her go, but not before making it clear that he'd be watching for her. The memory of that night burned in her chest as she submitted her law school applications. She wrote her personal statement longhand first, in the same composition notebook from that courthouse field trip, the pages now filled with years of notes, dreams, and carefully documented injustices. Northwestern accepted her with a full scholarship. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, and Terry read it 3 times before the words sank in. Beverly cried when Terry called her at work. William honked his bus horn in celebration, earning confused looks from his passengers. But even law school carried its own unique challenges. Professor Whitman, who taught constitutional law, had a habit of calling on Terry only when discussing civil rights cases, as if her perspective was only valuable when race was explicitly on the table. Her study group partners, all from Ivy League undergrad programs, spoke in a kind of coded language that assumed shared experiences. Summer houses in the Hamptons, family friends who were partners at white shoe firms, internships that had been secured through family connections. Terry learned to translate between worlds. She could code switch from the formal language of legal briefs to the warm rhythms of home, from the sterile atmosphere of the law review office to the comfortable chaos of Sunday dinner at her parents' house. She was fluent in both languages, but sometimes felt like a native speaker of neither. Her breakthrough came during her second year when she was assigned to Professor Martinez's clinic for wrongfully convicted defendants. The cases were heartbreaking, men and women who had lost years, sometimes decades, to a system that had failed them. Terry threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised even her professors. The Jameson case changed everything. David Jameson had spent 12 years in prison for a robbery he didn't commit, convicted largely on the testimony of a single eyewitness who later recanted. The evidence was overwhelming, but previous lawyers had missed crucial details in the police reports. Terry spent 3 weeks in the Cook County archives, her fingers black with dust from old files, following paper trails that others had ignored. She found it on a Thursday afternoon, a misfiled report that documented the real perpetrator's confession to another crime the same night. The timestamp proved Jameson's alibi. When she presented her findings to Professor Martinez, his usual composed expression cracked with amazement. "This is extraordinary work, Terry. Extraordinary." The exoneration hearing drew media attention. Terry sat in the gallery, watching as David Jameson walked free for the first time in over a decade. The TV cameras captured his tears, his family's joy, but they missed the quiet moment when he found Terry afterward in the courthouse corridor. "You gave me my life back," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you." Terry thought of Judge Kemball's sneer, of every door that had been slammed in her face, of every person who had looked right through her. "Just live it well," she told him. The case caught the attention of Sarah Chen, a federal prosecutor who had been quietly building corruption cases against several Cook County judges. Sarah had watched Terry's methodical dismantling of the Jameson conviction and saw something she desperately needed: a legal mind unafraid to challenge the system from within. "I have a proposition for you," Sarah said when she called Terry's apartment on a Sunday morning. "There's a federal investigation that could use someone with your particular talents, someone who understands how the system fails people and who knows how to build airtight cases." The irony wasn't lost on Terry when she learned that Judge Kemball was one of the targets. 20 years of suspicious sentencing patterns, plea bargains that seemed to correlate with defendants' ability to pay, relationships with court-appointed attorneys that crossed ethical lines. The investigation had been building for months, but they needed someone who could parse through decades of case files and identify the patterns. Terry said yes immediately. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was a monument to justice, all marble columns and soaring ceilings, with Lady Justice herself carved in relief above the main entrance. Terry's heels clicked against the polished floors as she made her way to the prosecutor's office, a box of evidence files balanced in her arms. She had been working the case for 6 months when the disciplinary hearing was scheduled. Judge Kemball, now in his late 60s, faced charges of judicial misconduct, racial bias in sentencing, and corruption. The evidence was damning. Statistical analyses showing clear patterns of harsher sentences for Black and Hispanic defendants, financial records linking him to several defense attorneys who consistently received favorable treatment, testimony from court staff about his inappropriate comments and behavior. Terry had built the case methodically, the same way she'd approached her law school studies and the Jameson exoneration. Every piece of evidence was double-checked, every witness statement corroborated, every legal precedent researched exhaustively. She knew the defense would try to discredit her. She was young, she was Black, she had a clear bias against their client. But the evidence spoke for itself. The hearing room was packed. Legal reporters filled the press gallery, sketching quick portraits of the key players. Judge Kemball sat at the defendant's table, his expensive suit and perfectly styled gray hair a stark contrast to the worry lines etched deep around his eyes. His defense team, 3 white men in identical navy suits, whispered among themselves and shuffled through thick manila folders. Terry took her place at the prosecutor's table, her own files organized in perfect chronological order. She wore a black suit her mother had helped her pick out, professional but not showy, authoritative but not aggressive. Around her neck was a small gold cross, a gift from her grandmother, and in her jacket pocket was that old composition notebook from 8th grade, carried for luck. When she stood to deliver her opening statement, Terry's voice was steady and clear. She spoke directly to the disciplinary panel, 3 judges and 2 public members, all of whom had the power to end Kemball's career. She laid out the case systematically, each piece of evidence building on the last, creating an undeniable pattern of bias and corruption. Pray. Over the past 23 years, Terry said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room, Judge Kemball has demonstrated a consistent pattern of racial bias in his sentencing decisions. African American defendants in his courtroom received sentences that were, on average, 47% longer than their white counterparts for identical charges and similar criminal histories. She clicked to the next slide in her presentation, a chart that showed the disparity in stark visual terms. This isn't about a few isolated incidents or poor judgment calls. This is about systematic discrimination that has destroyed lives, broken apart families, and undermined the very foundation of equal justice under law. Judge Kemball's face remained impassive, but Terry caught him glancing at her with a flicker of recognition. Did he remember that day in the courthouse 20 years ago? Did he remember the teenage girl whose question had made him so uncomfortable that he'd lashed out with casual cruelty? The testimony phase of the hearing lasted 3 days. Witness after witness took the stand. Defendants who had received harsh sentences, attorneys who had been pressured to accept unfavorable plea deals, court staff who had heard Judge Kemball's inappropriate comments about defendants' race, ethnicity, and social class. Maria Santos, whose son had received 5 years for a drug possession charge that typically carried probation, wept as she described watching her family fall apart. "He was just a kid," she said, her voice breaking. "He made a mistake, but Judge Kemball looked at him like he was already a criminal, like he didn't deserve a second chance because of where he came from." Dr. Shea. Amanda Foster, a criminal justice professor who had analyzed thousands of sentencing records, presented her statistical findings with clinical precision. The numbers were undeniable. Black defendants in Kemball's court received harsher sentences 73% of the time, even when controlling for criminal history, charge severity, and other relevant factors. "In my 30 years of studying judicial bias," Dr. Foster testified, "I have rarely seen such clear evidence of systematic discrimination. This isn't unconscious bias or cultural misunderstanding. This is deliberate, consistent prejudice that has shaped decades of legal decisions." Terry cross-examined each defense witness with surgical precision. When Judge Kemball's former clerk testified about his even-handed approach to justice, Terry presented her with documented examples of racial epithets the judge had used in chambers. When a defense attorney claimed that Kemball's sentences were always within legal guidelines, Terry showed him the statistical evidence of disparate treatment. But the most powerful moment came when Judge Kemball himself took the stand in his own defense. His attorney had clearly coached him well. He spoke in measured tones about the difficulty of judicial decision-making, the complexity of individual cases, the challenges of serving justice in a diverse community. "I have always strived to be fair and impartial," Judge Kemball said, his hands folded carefully in his lap. "If some of my decisions seem harsh in retrospect, it's because I believed in holding people accountable for their actions, regardless of their background." Terry's cross-examination was a masterclass in restraint and precision. She didn't raise her voice or show emotion. She simply presented him with case after case, decision after decision, asking him to explain the disparities. "Judge Kemball, in 2018, you sentenced Marcus Williams, a 19-year-old black man, to 2 years in prison for marijuana possession. The same week, you gave Timothy Fletcher, a 20-year-old white college student, probation for an identical charge. Can you explain the difference in your reasoning?" Judge Kemball shifted uncomfortably. "I would need to review the specific case files to recall the details that influenced those decisions." "I have them here," Terry said smoothly, handing him the files. "Please, take your time." The silence stretched as Judge Kemball flipped through the pages, searching for some distinction that would justify the disparity. There was none. Both defendants were first-time offenders. Both had similar amounts of marijuana. Both had expressed remorse and had family support. The only meaningful difference was the color of their skin. It's difficult to recall the specific circumstances that led to these particular sentences," Judge Kemball finally said. Terry nodded. "Let me show you 17 more similar cases from your docket." By the time she finished, Judge Kemball looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. His confident demeanor had cracked, revealing something desperate and small underneath. In that moment, Terry felt no triumph, only a profound sadness for all the lives that had been damaged by his prejudice. The disciplinary panel deliberated for 2 hours. When they returned, the chairwoman, Judge Patricia Williams, read their findings with grave formality. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, this panel finds Judge Robert Kemble guilty of judicial misconduct, systematic bias in sentencing, and conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. The panel recommends immediate removal from the bench and permanent disbarment from the practice of law. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and shouted reactions. Terry remained seated, her hands folded on the table, watching as Judge Kemble's world collapsed around him. His wife, sitting in the front row of the gallery, covered her face with her hands. His grown children stared in shock. After the hearing, Terry found herself surrounded by reporters asking for comment. She thought of all the things she could say, all the righteous anger she could express, all the personal vindication she could claim. Instead, she kept her statement simple. Today, the system worked the way it's supposed to work. Nobody is above the law, and nobody should be below it either. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about making sure this never happens again. That evening, Terry sat in her small apartment, looking at the newspaper clippings and case files scattered across her dining table. Her mother called to congratulate her, her voice thick with pride. Her father sent a text that simply said, "Knew you could do it, baby girl." Professor Martinez emailed to tell her that several major law firms were already calling about job opportunities. But the call that meant the most came from Sarah Chen. "The Attorney General's office is creating a new civil rights unit," Sarah said. "They want someone to head up judicial accountability, someone with your background and your instincts. Interested?" Terry looked across her living room at the framed photo on her bookshelf, her 8th grade class picture, where she sat in the back row with that same quiet determination in her eyes. Next to it was her law school diploma, and next to that was a newspaper clipping from David Jameson's exoneration. "Very interested," she said. 6 months later, Terry stood before a packed auditorium at Northwestern Law School, delivering the keynote address for the school's Diversity and Inclusion Symposium. The speech had been entitled, "Seeing the Invisible, Breaking Down Barriers in Legal Education and Practice." But Terry knew it was really about something simpler and more profound. "When I was 14 years old," she began, her voice carrying clearly to the back of the room, "a judge told me I'd never be a lawyer. He meant it as an insult, a way to put me in what he thought was my proper place. What he didn't realize was that he had just given me the most powerful motivation I could have asked for." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. That judge saw a black girl from the South Side and assumed he knew everything about what I could and couldn't accomplish. He looked at my thrift store clothes and my home address and decided I wasn't worth his respect or consideration. What he didn't see was 20 years of determination, thousands of hours of study, and an absolute refusal to let other people's limitations become my own. Terry paused, letting her words sink in. Today, that same judge is no longer on the bench, not because I sought revenge, but because justice demanded accountability. The system he used to demean and discriminate finally held him responsible for the harm he caused, and the girl he tried to silence became the prosecutor who brought the case against him. The applause started slowly, then built to a thunderous crescendo. Students rose to their feet, professors wiped away tears, and Terry felt something she'd been carrying for 20 years finally lift from her shoulders. After the speech, Terry walked across campus to her car, the autumn air crisp against her face. In her briefcase was a speech request from the Justice Department's annual conference, and in her jacket pocket was that old composition notebook, its pages now filled with legal citations, case notes, and the names of people she had helped along the way. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Watched your speech online. So proud of you, baby. Grandma would have loved this." Terry smiled, thinking of her grandmother who had cleaned white people's houses for 40 years and always told her that education was the one thing nobody could take away from her. She had been right, of course, but it was more than that. Education wasn't just about what you learned. It was about who you became in the process of learning it. The next morning, Terry found herself back in a courtroom, but this time as a federal prosecutor presenting a case about voting rights violations. The defendant was a county clerk who had systematically made it harder for Black and Hispanic citizens to register to vote. The evidence was overwhelming, the case was righteous, and Terry felt the familiar surge of purpose that came with fighting for justice. As she stood to address the jury, Terry caught sight of a group of high school students in the gallery, there for their own civics field trip. One girl, sitting in the back row, was taking careful notes in a composition notebook. When their eyes met, the girl smiled shyly and raised her hand in a small wave. After court that day, Terry approached the girl's teacher and asked if she could speak to the class for a few minutes. The students gathered around her in the courthouse corridor, their faces bright with curiosity. "How many of you have been told you can't do something because of where you come from or what you look like?" Terry asked. Almost every hand went up. Terry nodded. "Good. Hold on to that feeling. Remember who made you feel small and why. Then use it as fuel to prove them wrong. Not because you want revenge, but because the world needs your voice, your perspective, your talent. Don't let anyone convince you that you're invisible, because I guarantee you that somebody needs to see exactly what you have to offer." The girl with the notebook approached her afterward. "Ms. Sloan, I want to be a lawyer too, but my guidance counselor says I should think about something more realistic." Terry smiled and pulled out a business card. "Call me next week. Let's talk about summer internship opportunities." That evening, Terry sat in her office at the Justice Department, working late on a brief about police accountability. Through her window, she could see the lights of Washington, D.C., twinkling in the darkness. On her desk was a photo of her parents at her swearing-in ceremony, their faces radiant with pride. Next to it was a letter from David Jameson, now working as a community organizer, thanking her again for giving him his life back. The bronze nameplate on her door read, "Terry Sloan, Deputy Assistant Attorney General, Civil Rights Division." But the title that meant the most to her was the one Judge Kemble had told her she'd never earn: lawyer. As she worked, Terry thought about all the invisible people in courtrooms across America, the defendants who weren't being heard, the families who weren't being considered, the communities that weren't being served. Tomorrow, she would continue fighting for them, using the law as both sword and shield in the endless battle for justice. Her phone chimed with a reminder about her TEDx talk next month. The title was, "From Invisible to Indispensable: Why Our Differences Make Us Stronger." Terry smiled, thinking about what she would tell that audience of changemakers and activists and dreamers. She would tell them about the power of being underestimated, about the strength that comes from having to prove yourself over and over again. She would tell them about the responsibility that comes with success and the importance of reaching back to help others climb the same mountains you've conquered. But most of all, she would tell them what her grandmother had whispered to her on her deathbed. "Baby girl, they can try to make you invisible, but they can never make you insignificant. Your light is going to shine whether they want it to or not." Terry closed her laptop and gathered her things. As she walked through the empty corridors of the Justice Department, her heels clicking against the marble floors, she thought about that 14-year-old girl who had asked a question in a courtroom 20 years ago. That girl had been looking for answers about justice and fairness and the promise of equality under law. Now, 20 years later, Terry was still asking questions. The difference was that now, when she spoke, people had to listen. And when she demanded answers, the system had to respond. Justice, Terry had learned, wasn't something you found. It was something you built, case by case, decision by decision, one invisible person at a time.